It was close to midnight in Portland, the rain falling in thin silver threads against the windshield of the ambulance. Julia Dawson sat in the passenger seat, her gloved hands resting on her knees, waiting for the next call that might or might not come before her shift ended. Portland nights were quiet in that uneasy way, sirens fading somewhere far off, the city glistening under the mist. Then the radio cracked to life. Unit 47. Respond to a medical emergency. Artemis Country Club, NW Skyline Boulevard. Possible anaphylaxis. Adult male, conscious but deteriorating. Julia's body reacted before her mind did. "Copy that en route," she said, nodding to Vasily, the driver. Zina, her partner, reached for the trauma kit. The wail of the siren cut through the drizzle as they sped toward the hills. By the time they arrived, the club's parking lot was a maze of luxury cars, headlights reflecting off puddles. Inside, laughter and music spilled from the ballroom, a live band still playing despite the panic at one of the tables. A man in a tuxedo was slumped forward, his face swollen, gasping for air while a woman screamed for help. Julia dropped to her knees beside him. "Epinephrine. 1 milligram IM," she said firmly. Zina prepped the injection. Julia steadied the man's arm, and the needle sank in. Oxygen, 10 liters, mask on. Within moments, color returned to his cheeks, the wheezing eased. "Good," Julia murmured, checking his pulse. "We'll transfer him for monitoring. But he's stable." Applause rippled through the crowd, a tense kind of relief. Julia stood, peeled off her gloves, and turned to find the event organizer, then froze. Across the dance floor, near the dais, stood the groom. He was tall, wearing a black tuxedo and a small rose pin to his lapel. The soft lights from the chandeliers caught his profile. Sharp and familiar, too familiar. Julia's heart stopped for a beat. She knew that face. The same dark hair. The same curve of a smile she'd memorized years ago. "David!" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man's eyes flicked toward her, confusion crossing his features. "I'm sorry," he said, polite but distant. Her throat tightened. "David Miller, it's me, Julia." A murmur rippled among the guests. The bride stiffened. The man shook his head. "You're mistaken. My name is Eric Miller." "No," she said, quickly desperate. You have the same birthmark behind your right ear. Enough." The deep, authoritative voice cut through the air. From the head table, an older man rose, Richard Montgomery, father of the bride. His face was red with anger. "This is a private event. Get her out of here." 2 security guards stepped forward. Julia tried to explain, but the words came out tangled. He looks exactly like out," Montgomery snapped. They escorted her toward the exit as guests whispered behind their hands. Julia's cheeks burned as she stepped back into the rain. The ballroom doors shut with a dull thud, sealing the music inside. She stood there for a long moment, soaked and trembling, watching the reflections blur in the puddles. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was madness. But she knew what she'd seen. The man inside wasn't just a stranger. He was the ghost of a love she'd buried years ago. The rain hadn't stopped when Julia returned home. Her apartment, a small second-floor unit near St. John's Bridge, smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic. The city lights shimmered on the wet pavement below, casting ripples of gold against her living room wall. She tossed her damp jacket over a chair and sat down on the couch, too wired to sleep. Murchik, her old tabby cat, stretched and blinked at her from the armrest. Julia reached over, absently running her fingers through his fur. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," she murmured. The image of the man in the tuxedo wouldn't leave her mind. The same angular jawline, the same quiet smile, even the tiny scar beneath his chin. He wasn't just similar, he was David. But that was impossible. David Miller had disappeared 15 years ago, swallowed by time and silence. She got up and went to the closet. On the highest shelf sat a weathered shoebox wrapped in faded blue ribbon. Julia hesitated before pulling it down. Inside were fragments of a life she had long buried, a small silver ring, ticket stubs from summer fairs, and a stack of old Polaroids. She spread them out on the coffee table. There they were, two young faces frozen in laughter. She was 19, her cheeks still soft, eyes full of trust. He was 20, a guitar slung over his shoulder, the kind of boy who made the world feel wide and full of promise. David had been her first everything. First love, first heartbreak, first lesson in how fragile happiness could be. He was wild and charming, the kind of man who'd race the wind just to feel alive. She was the careful one, always planning, always worrying. They'd met at a campus blood drive, of all places, she as a volunteer, he as a reluctant donor. By the end of the week, they were inseparable, but love that burns too bright never lasts. Jealousy crept in during their second year together. Julia had seen him laughing with a girl from his band, and something in her had snapped. Harsh words were said, apologies came too late, and just like that, he was gone. He moved out of town with his mother not long after. She wrote letters that were never answered. Eventually, silence became her answer. Years blurred. Julia finished her training, became a paramedic, and married Stanley Dawson, a dentist whose idea of affection was scheduling dinner between appointments. The marriage was short and cold. They divorced quietly, no children, no drama. Just two people realizing there was nothing left to save. Now, sitting in the half-light of her living room, Julia felt the old wound reopen. The memory of David's smile ached like a bruise. She turned the photograph over and traced his name on the back, the ink faded but still visible. Eric Miller, the groom she'd seen tonight. He had David's face, David's voice, even the same habit of tilting his head when listening. No one could look that much alike by chance. Julia leaned back, the storm outside deepening. Coincidence? Maybe. But something in her gut whispered otherwise. This wasn't coincidence. It was fate, knocking again after 15 long years. The next morning, the rain had finally cleared, leaving the streets of Portland washed clean under a pale winter sun. Julia sat in her car outside the glass-fronted building of Rose Crown Confections, her fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel. Through the windshield, she could see employees in white coats moving about inside, the sweet scent of sugar drifting faintly from the factory vents. She told herself she only came to clear her mind, to prove she wasn't losing touch with reality. But when she saw the name Eric Miller engraved on the office directory beside operations manager, her chest tightened. This was him, the man from the wedding, the man who looked like David. She inhaled sharply, checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, and stepped out. The receptionist greeted her with polite indifference until Julia introduced herself as a paramedic from the wedding incident the night before. I just need a few minutes of Mr. Miller's time, she said softly. Moments later, Eric appeared from the hallway. In the light of day, he looked even more like David, his movements, his voice, the easy but careful way he stood. You're the medic from last night, he said, guarded but not unkind. Yes, Julia replied, her palms damp. I'm sorry about the scene I caused. I need to show you something. He hesitated, then gestured toward a quiet corner of the lobby. All right, but make it quick. Julia reached into her bag and unfolded a faded Polaroid. In it, a younger version of herself leaned against a tree, laughing. Beside her was a man who could have been Eric's twin. Same smile, same eyes, same everything. Eric took the photo carefully, staring at it for a long time. This looks like me, he said finally, his voice uncertain. But I've never seen this picture before. That's because it's not you, Julia said quietly. His name was David Miller. I loved him. He disappeared 15 years ago with his mother, and I never heard from him again. Eric frowned, still looking at the photograph. I don't have any brothers, he murmured. At least, not that I know of. My parents would have told me. Julia swallowed hard. David had a small birthmark behind his right ear, like a crescent moon. Slowly, Eric lifted his hand, brushing the spot just below his ear. His fingertips found it, faint but there. He went pale. Do you see? She whispered. You can't tell me this is just coincidence. Eric exhaled shakily and handed the picture back. I don't know what to say. I don't remember anything like this. But I'll ask my parents. Maybe there's something I don't know. Julia nodded, her throat tight. Please do. I need to understand what's happening. He looked at her one last time, eyes filled with confusion and something close to fear. So do I, he said softly, then turned and walked away down the corridor. Julia stood there long after he was gone, the faint hum of the candy machines filling the silence. Outside, sunlight reflected off the wet pavement, sharp and cold. Somehow, deep down, she knew this wasn't over. Something long buried was clawing its way back to the surface, and neither of them was ready for what it would uncover. Eric drove home that evening with the image of the photograph burned into his mind. The highway lights stretched into long, pale lines before his eyes, but he barely noticed them. Every word Julia had said kept echoing in his head. The same face, the same birthmark, the same name. None of it made sense. When he stepped into the quiet house on the outskirts of Portland, the smell of chamomile tea drifted from the kitchen. His mother, Helen Miller, sat by the window, knitting a pale blue sweater. She smiled when she saw him, though her hands trembled slightly from age. You're home early, she said. Eric didn't respond right away. He set his coat on the back of a chair and studied her face. Mom, I need to ask you something, he said finally. Helen looked up. What is it? Sweetheart, was I ever a twin? The knitting needles froze midair. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of the clock ticking above the stove. Why would you ask that? Because someone showed me a picture today, he said, voice tightening. A picture of a man who looks exactly like me. Same face, same scar, same everything. She said his name was David Miller. Helen's color drained. The needles slipped from her hands and clattered onto the table. She pressed a trembling palm to her mouth. Oh, God, she whispered. You found out. Eric's stomach twisted. So it's true. Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded. Yes, you had a brother. You were born together, 2 healthy boys. But there was a fire at the hospital that night. The maternity ward burned. The nurses ran with the newborns. And when it was over, one of you was gone. He stared at her, unable to breathe. Gone? How do you lose a baby? They said maybe someone mixed up the tags, or maybe he was taken. We searched for months, but the hospital closed, records vanished. And your father, he couldn't bear to keep looking. We never told you. You were all we had left. Eric pushed away from the table, pacing the room. You kept this from me my entire life. His voice broke somewhere between anger and disbelief. Helen wiped her tears. I wanted to protect you. There was nothing left to find, Eric. Sometimes the past is better left buried. He shook his head, gripping the back of a chair. No, someone out there had my brother's face. He was real, and I need to know what happened to him. Helen looked at him helplessly. If you dig, you'll only bring back pain. Maybe, he said quietly, but not knowing hurts worse. He grabbed his keys and stepped out before she could answer. The cool night air hit his face, grounding him just enough to pull his phone from his pocket. Julia answered on the second ring. Eric. I talked to my mother, he said, his voice low and unsteady. She admitted it. I had a twin. He disappeared in a hospital fire the night we were born. There was silence, then Julia's breath caught. Oh, my God, my mother worked at that hospital, she whispered. She told me stories about that fire. I never imagined. Then maybe we can find the truth together, Eric said. Julia's voice trembled. Yes, we have to. As he hung up, Eric looked back at the house, his mother still framed by the window, her face pale in the lamplight. For the first time in his life, he realized how little he truly knew about the family he came from, and how much had been lost in the smoke of that long-forgotten night. 2 days later, Julia sat across from Eric in a quiet cafe tucked between old brick warehouses in the Pearl District. Through the tall windows, the late morning sun reflected off puddles left by last night's rain. Steam curled from their untouched coffee cups, and the air smelled faintly of roasted beans and cedar. Eric's hands were clasped on the table. I asked around, he said quietly. A friend from my company recommended someone, a private investigator, ex-detective. His name's Peter Harlan. Julia looked up, weary but resolute. Then let's hire him. I need to know who David was. What happened after he left? Within an hour, they were sitting in Harlan's office, a small space filled with dusty case files and the low hum of an old air conditioner. The man himself was in his 60s, lean, with sharp eyes and a voice that carried authority. He listened as they explained everything, from the photograph to the hospital fire to the uncanny resemblance between Eric and David. When they finished, Harlan leaned back in his chair. All right, he said. I'll start with hospital archives and birth records from St. Mary's, then move forward from there. Give me a couple of weeks. The waiting felt endless. Julia went through her shifts at Portland EMS mechanically, her mind never far from the investigation. Each time her phone buzzed, her heart jumped. Then, on a gray afternoon, Eric finally called. He found something, he said. They met again at the same cafe, the rain tapping against the windows. Harlan sat opposite them, a manila folder resting on the table. He looked from Julia to Eric, his expression unreadable. I'll be straight with you, he began. The hospital fire was real. Records confirmed twin boys born to Helen Miller that night. One listed as deceased, but there's no death certificate. The second infant was recorded as transferred but without signature. After that, the trail goes cold for years. Then, 15 years later, a man named David Miller appears in Spokane, Washington. Same birth date, same features. Eric leaned forward, his knuckles whitening. That's him. Harlan nodded. He worked as a professional stunt rider, married a woman named Claire Evans. They were known for doing motorcycle shows up and down the coast. His voice softened. Last year, both died in a highway crash near Bend. Drunk driver ran a red light. No surviving parents, no siblings listed. Julia's world tilted. No, she whispered, shaking her head. That can't be. There's more, Harlan said gently. They had a daughter, Emily, 3 years old. She's in the Multnomah County foster system. Julia pressed a hand to her mouth. For a moment, the cafe blurred around her. The hiss of the espresso machine, the murmur of voices, all fading beneath the rush of her heartbeat. David was gone, but a part of him was still here, living, breathing. Where is she now? She asked. Harlan slid a paper across the table, an address, a case number. In temporary care, waiting for placement. If you're serious, you'll need to contact Family Services. Julia wiped her eyes, her voice trembling but firm. I will. Eric reached across the table, his hand steady over hers. We both will. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, thin and fragile, but enough to remind them that some pieces of the past were still waiting to be found. The next morning, the air was crisp and clear as Julia parked in front of the Multnomah County Family Services building. The glass doors reflected a gray sky, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the folder of documents Peter Harlan had given her. She had spent the night reading them over and over, the report confirming David's death, the mention of a daughter named Emily, age 3. Inside, the reception area was bright but sterile, filled with the faint hum of computers and the soft voices of caseworkers answering phones. A mural of painted butterflies covered one wall, meant to make the space feel welcoming. But to Julia, it only reminded her how fragile everything was. "I'm here to see Emily Miller," she said to the woman behind the counter. "Her case number is—" She fumbled with the paper, her voice trembling. "I knew her father." The woman's polite smile faltered. "Are you a relative, ma'am?" Julia hesitated. "Not legally. But I'm sorry," the woman said gently. "We can't permit visits without approved kinship or court authorization. Emily is in temporary foster placement." Julia felt the air leave her lungs. "Please," she said quietly. "Her father was someone I loved. I just need to know she's okay." Before the worker could respond, a familiar voice spoke behind her. "She's with me." Julia turned. Eric stood in the doorway, rein still on his coat. He approached the counter and handed over his ID. "Eric Miller. Emily's my niece. My brother was her father." The woman's expression shifted instantly. "You're listed as her next of kin," she said, flipping through the file. "We can arrange a brief, supervised visit. Follow me, please." Julia's legs felt weak as they walked down the hallway. Walls lined with children's drawings, houses, stick figures, sons with smiling faces. When they reached a playroom, the caseworker opened the door and stepped aside. Inside, a little girl sat on the floor, stacking wooden blocks into a crooked tower. She had light brown hair tied in a loose braid and wide blue eyes, David's eyes. The sight of her made Julia's heart stop. "Emily," the worker said softly, "you have visitors." The child looked up. For a moment, confusion flickered across her face. Then, as if recognizing something unseen, she stood and walked straight to Julia. "Mom," the girl said, her voice small but certain. Julia froze, her throat closing. She knelt, hands shaking, and the little girl threw her arms around her neck. Julia felt the warmth of her tiny heartbeat, the softness of her hair. All the air in the room seemed to vanish. Eric turned away, wiping his eyes. Julia whispered, "I'm not your mom's sweetheart, but I promise you're safe now." Emily looked up, smiling, her eyes bright with trust. In that instant, Julia knew this wasn't chance or coincidence. This was David's last gift to her, a fragment of the life they'd lost, returned to her in the form of this child. As she held Emily close, the ache that had lived in her for 15 years began at last to ease. The Montgomery estate stood on the edge of the city, overlooking the Willamette River like a monument to wealth and exhaustion. Olivia Montgomery Miller drifted through its marble halls as if it were a stage, always dressed for an audience that no longer existed. Eric had stopped trying to follow her rhythm months ago. Tonight, she returned home past midnight, perfume sharp with champagne and smoke. Her heels clicked against the marble as she tossed her clutch onto the counter. "Don't start," she said, not even looking at him. "I wasn't going to," he replied quietly, setting down the book he hadn't been reading. "But maybe you should tell me where you were." She laughed, a brittle sound. "At a party, obviously. Where else would I be?" "Every night. Maybe I like people who actually have fun." She turned, eyes glittering under the recessed lights. "You used to. Before you decided you wanted to play the grieving brother." Eric's jaw tightened. "Don't talk about him." "Why not?" "You've been obsessed with that woman since the wedding. Julia. The medic, whatever she is. Do you even hear yourself? You're married, Eric. To me." Her words cut, but the edge of truth in them hurt more. "We were married," he said softly. "In name only. You don't want a home, Olivia. You don't want children. You want noise, lights, attention." She smirked. "And you want tragedy. Maybe you should have married her instead." He rose from the chair. Maybe I should have. The silence that followed was so sharp it rang in his ears. Olivia's expression hardened. You'll regret this. My father. I've already spoken to him, Eric said. He told me if I leave, I lose everything. The cars, the accounts, the business ties. All of it. She crossed her arms. Then you'll crawl back in a month. He met her gaze. No, I'll build something different. Her laugh followed him down the hall. Cruel and echoing. You're nothing without us, Eric. You never were. By the time he reached the garage, rain was falling again. Soft at first, then steady. He loaded a single suitcase into the trunk and drove until the city lights blurred behind him. When he stopped, it was outside Julia's small apartment near St. John's Bridge. The windows glowed faintly against the rain. He stood on the porch for a moment, unsure if he should knock. Then the door opened. Julia stood there in a cardigan, her hair loose around her face, surprise flickering in her eyes. Eric. He tried to speak, but his voice caught. Can I stay here? Just for a while. She hesitated only a second before nodding. Come in. Inside, Emily's toys were scattered across the rug, and the faint smell of cocoa filled the air. Julia handed him a towel, and he dried his hair, watching as she knelt to pick up the blocks. Rough night, she asked gently. You could say that. He managed a faint smile. I think I finally did the right thing. She looked up at him, something unspoken passing between them, a quiet understanding born of shared loss and second chances. Outside, the rain kept falling, steady and relentless. But inside that small apartment, for the first time in years, Eric felt the weight on his chest begin to lift. A full year had passed since the night Eric had shown up at Julia's door. The world around them seemed gentler now, quieter, steadier. The small apartment that had once felt too silent was now filled with laughter, toys, and the smell of pancakes on Sunday mornings. That morning, a letter from Multnomah County Family Services sat on the kitchen counter, the envelope stamped with the word approved. Julia's hands trembled as she opened it, and the moment she read the words adoption finalized, her breath caught. She looked at Eric, tears already forming. She's ours, she whispered. Eric took her into his arms, his voice thick. We did it. She's home for good. Across the room, Emily sat on the floor coloring, humming to herself. When Julia told her the news, the little girl smiled wide and asked, Does that mean I can stay forever? Julia knelt beside her, forever and ever. That evening, they celebrated with pizza and cake, Emily insisting on blowing out the candles herself. It wasn't a grand occasion, just 3 people sitting around a tiny kitchen table. But to Julia, it felt like the world had finally righted itself. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of their lives found a natural pace. Julia still worked her shifts with Portland EMS, though less often now, while Eric managed his new job at a small logistics firm. Their world was simple, but peaceful, something neither of them had truly known before. Then, one morning in late spring, Julia woke up feeling different. A dull nausea rolled through her stomach. At first, she dismissed it, too much coffee, maybe the stress of night shifts. But as the days passed, the exhaustion deepened. When she mentioned it to her colleague Zena, the woman raised an eyebrow. You sure it's not something else? Julia laughed, shaking her head. Zena, you know I can't get pregnant. I was diagnosed years ago. Still, Zena said, handing her a small box. Humor me. That evening, after Emily was asleep, Julia stood in the bathroom, heart pounding. 2 pink lines appeared before she could even blink. She sat on the edge of the tub, covering her mouth, tears spilling freely. When Eric came home, she handed him the test wordlessly. He stared at it, disbelief flickering across his face before breaking into pure joy. You're kidding, he whispered. Julia shook her head, laughing through her tears. 16 weeks, she managed. The doctor confirmed it this morning. I don't know how, but Eric pulled her into his arms. His laughter choked with emotion. It's a miracle, he said, over and over, as if the words themselves could make it real. In the doorway, Emily stirred, rubbing her eyes. Why are you crying, Mama? Julia knelt, wiping her cheeks. Because I'm happy, sweetheart. The little girl climbed into her lap, resting her head against Julia's shoulder. Eric wrapped his arms around them both. For the first time in years, Julia didn't just feel whole, she felt chosen. As if life had finally returned everything it had once taken away. The afternoon light filtered softly through the trees of Forest Park, scattering golden flecks across the moss and ferns. Julia pushed the stroller along the winding path, her fingers lightly brushing the handle while the sound of birds echoed through the cool, pine-scented air. Beside her, Eric carried a thermos of coffee, and Emily skipped a few steps ahead, her laughter breaking through the quiet like sunlight through clouds. The world felt slower now, gentle, deliberate. For the first time in a long time, Julia wasn't thinking about what she'd lost, but about everything she'd found. Inside the stroller, baby Matthew stirred, tiny fists waving beneath his blanket. Emily peeked over the edge and giggled. He looks like my doll, she said proudly, but he's louder. Eric laughed. Let's hope he doesn't take after me then. Julia smiled at them both, her heart swelling with something too big to name. The last few months had been a blur of sleepless nights, bottles, and bedtime stories, but none of it felt like a burden. Every cry, every small hand reaching for hers, it all felt like home. They reached a clearing overlooking the river. Julia stopped to take it in, the water shimmering below, the city's skyline distant and soft in the afternoon haze. Emily climbed onto a nearby rock, spreading her arms. This is our place, she announced. Eric nodded. Our little kingdom. Julia leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. Who would have thought, she whispered, that something so broken could turn into this? Eric squeezed her hand. Sometimes life doesn't take away. It just rearranges things until they fit again. A gust of wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint laughter of other families nearby. As Julia turned, her gaze caught on a familiar figure standing at the edge of the trail, a tall man in an expensive coat, silver hair glinting in the light. Richard Montgomery. He stood motionless for a moment, watching them. The confident posture that had once filled boardrooms and ballrooms seemed smaller now. Fragile in the face of what he saw, a man he dismissed, holding everything money could never buy. Their eyes met briefly. Julia gave a polite nod. Richard's gaze softened, and for the first time he didn't look proud or angry, just human. He lowered his head slightly, then turned and walked away. Julia watched him go, her heart unexpectedly at peace. Emily tugged her sleeve. Mama, can we come here again tomorrow? Julia knelt to zip up her daughter's jacket. Of course, sweetheart. As long as you want. As they started back toward the car, Eric adjusted the blanket around Matthew and looked at Julia. She smiled, the fading sunlight warm on her face. In that quiet moment, surrounded by laughter and the rustle of leaves, she finally understood what life had been trying to teach her all along. True wealth isn't measured in numbers, but in the hearts that choose to stay.